Right, so I'm going to talk about testing infrastructure, but I'll try and sort of get into why I think that's interesting. I used to dress smartly when I worked for the government. I'm now a Puppet Labs employee, so I have to wear Puppet t-shirts. I have a newsletter that a few people like, and I wrote an awful lot of Puppet modules, and so a lot of my testing experience comes from both using a bunch of these, but also writing modules that lots of other people use. And as Travis just said, I've just joined Puppet Labs this month. Bizarrely, I'm not talking about a bunch of stuff. I'm definitely not talking about sort of finished software, either in terms of things I've been hacking around on, or certainly Puppet Labs stuff. I'm not talking about individual module testing. There's a lot of good material there. I'm not talking about Puppet Lint, Puppet Syntax, rspec-puppet, Beaker. There's a bunch of other talks around that. I was going to put this slide in and point people at this talk I gave. I'm actually now giving this talk this afternoon because someone's dropped out. So if you're interested in module testing, come along to that talk later on. More interestingly, I'm talking about experiments. I'm talking about things like testing images and containers. So the keynote this morning with Luke's questions, people were saying, well, how does Puppet play in that space? I've got a few sort of prototypes, a few experiments to talk through. I'm going to talk a bit about test driving infrastructure as a service. I'm a bit obsessed with test-driven development as a design practice. And I think applying that to infrastructure as code is really interesting. And I'm going to use PuppetDB for a whole bunch of strange things. So this might feel like a sort of set of quite separate chunks. And that's sorted by design. Hopefully, it's interesting and useful. It's definitely not sort of something where you'd go do all of these things. But I think some of them are hopefully useful now. Some of them might be useful later. So if you're working in the sort of, whether it's EC2 or even sort of on a VMware stack, at some point you're building images. And you might be building one and then doing everything on top of it. You might be building many of them. Having a tool chain for doing this is really useful. Packer's the tool I've tended to be using, and I think it's picked up a lot of sort of people to do this, because we get to declare what our images look like in code. So with Packer configuration, it looks something a bit like this. It's a JSON file. You're declaring sort of, and in this case, a type of sort of, it's an Amazon image I'm building. The details that allow me to connect to the API so I can build that image. It's just config. Packer has some nice Puppet integration, which makes hooking into like all these modules, all the actual Puppet tools for putting things onto the images really easy. Again, a few lines of JSON. But everyone's already doing that if you're building images. And it's not a talk about Packer. But how do we know that image works before you publish the image for it to be used in by the next 100 servers you stand up? I'd really like to know if that works before I publish that. And that's where my answer to nearly everything is add some tests. So Packer provides basically a sort of, you can have multiple provisioners. So a provisioner like Puppet to set something up. After Puppet runs, we can have a shell provisioner to run a shell script. That script would execute on the instance as it's building. There's also a plugin for Packer that allows you to execute code on the machine that's running Packer, so from outside the image. So we can test things both inside. We can run code both inside and outside. At that point, we can write tests and execute tests in both of those places. One tool that's picking up a bunch of sort of interest for this sort of infrastructure testing is Serverspec. So is anyone in the room using Serverspec? Ooh, a good bunch of hands. Lots of people not. That's good. Serverspec it's basically, it's just rspec. It's just the Ruby testing sort of tool with some helpers for doing the common things that testing infrastructure requires. So this is an example of basically just saying the locales package should be installed. If you squint, this looks a bit like Puppet, and I'll come back to why that's actually useful rather than weird later. So we can have tests for that. Not just that our Puppet code is saying it's doing something, but it actually happens. And under the hood, Beaker, the integration testing framework, uses Serverspec for this sort of things. And it's not just packages. We've got packages and services. We've got all the sort of primitives that you'd expect. And it's also Ruby, so we can have loops and iteration. We can get the data from elsewhere. We can do the things like we want to do. Serverspec supports loads of these sort of primitives. So you're not having to write a lot of code to do the testing of the types of things you're probably interested in, whether it's sort of PPAs, RC Linux. There's actually a whole bunch of Windows primitives as well, so you can test on Windows. And the idea here is that rather than just sort of running a command and building an image and hoping it worked and then using it for a load of servers and those servers not working, as part of the building of the image, we run the tests, and we only publish the image for if the tests pass. The moment we're doing that, you've got this continuous integration pipeline. Rather than me running this on my local machine, let's set it up so basically whenever you change either the Puppet modules or the packet configuration, it's going to automatically build something. It's going to automatically publish that if the tests pass. If not, it's going to tell you they failed. We've got a nice continuous integration loop. So I've been using Worker for this, which is a sort of software as a service sort of CI system. You could use Jenkins, or you could use Travis CI. You could use any sort of automation tool of your choice. I've been quite liking Worker recently because it allows me to define a bunch of steps. And there's an example online of this whole sort of tool chain working. So if people are interested in playing around with that, there's a full working example that ties all these things together and you can use. I mentioned sort of you could use Travis or Jenkins. But what we're doing, the fact that this is built, and the example here was building an AMI for Amazon. Well, it could be building an image for VMware. It could be building something for Azure. It could be building a container. Again, like sort of, if you started using Docker, or if you're doing a bunch of stuff with LXC, or if you've been using Solaris for 10 years, like building these things is actually, we've got tools to do this really easily. But how do you know they work before you, again, fire up 100 of them? We don't want to be testing at the point where it's expensive and they're in production. And like maybe you've got the load balancer set up so they're not, like they fail the health check. But you've still wasted a load of time and effort and energy. Getting the testing in early is really important. And again, you can tie the same thing into Docker. You could tie, like the Docker file allows you to specify a bunch of commands. Have a command that runs tests both from inside and outside that container before you publish it, and set that up in a continuous integration workflow. And you're immediately much more reliable. I think that's one of the examples I'm talking through. That's probably so I've used this in Anger. It works really well. A bunch of people are doing similar things. That's like on a sort of scale of like do this now versus like think about this. That if you're building images, if you're building containers, get testing in now. It's well worth it. Serverspec's a very easy route into doing that. So that's one example. Hopefully I'm not going too quickly. Luke tells me I'd speak far too fast. So one of the other areas I mentioned I'm somewhat obsessed with is sort of using test-driven development. And for those that aren't familiar with the sort of the practice, the idea here is that first the developer writes an automated test case that defines a desired improvement or new feature. And it's first. At this point, you might have no code, you might have nothing, or you might have an existing application that does a bunch of stuff. But first, we're going to write a test case that is about the new feature or the improvement. Then produce the minimum amount of code to pass the test, and the bit a lot of people forget and end up with terrible code is and finally refactor that new code so basically it fits, it's nice, it feels right. But at that point, it is about taste and semantics and getting across the intent because you know it works because you've got the test to back you up. The important bit there is it's first you write the test, not like write some tests afterwards. There's benefits to writing tests later. There's other benefits to writing tests first. And stepping slightly to one side is like, I just said your infrastructure should have an API. Like, if you're running in AWS, if you're running in Azure, well, it has an API because that's the only interaction you have. But even if you have a lot of hardware, even if you have a lot of just like you're running your own stuff, having like a good, solid configuration management database of that information that you can query, that you can question, like having a provisioning platform, Cobbler or Foreman or whatever, your infrastructure should have an API. So combining my sort of obsession with test-driven development and the fact that my infrastructure has an API, what if we write tests against that API? And remember, what I'm interested in is writing tests before I do something. And I'll show some examples that hopefully make that make sense. A really quick aside, I'm quite liking Clojure at the moment, so I wrote all these examples in Clojure. It's really nice for building these sort of domain-specific languages, and hopefully the examples will make sense, even though most people are probably not Clojure programmers. I said these are experiments. Whether this is the best technology to do this in is sort of moot. I'm interested in the idea more than the implementation. You could write this in anything. And what sort of falls out really is, like, I started floating around this word policy. What I'm trying to do is codify the meetings you have before you set up your infrastructure. You've probably all had them. Like a bunch of people go into a room and the finance people or the sort of product person say, like, well, we can only spend this much money. And everyone goes, oh, OK. Or maybe there's a compliance person saying, we can't put any of our users' data in this country or this country or this country. And everyone goes, right, cool, yep. And we write that down. We say, like, everything should be backed up. And you go, like, yep, OK. All these things that we have, we go into a meeting room, we discuss, we all agree on. But actually, how do we assert that they're true in a way that is sort of like completely unambiguous? We probably don't. And I'd reason that unless you're testing something, unless you're verifying it all the time, it's probably not true 6 months later. So an example might be, I don't want to launch too many nodes. They're expensive. Like we've got a cap on the amount of like things we want to deal with. So why not turn that into a test? I say that that's Clojure code, but you get the idea. It's sort of, well, expect the count of the nodes to be less than 100. I don't want any stop nodes. They're costing me money. So basically, if you were running somewhere that like stopped things still cost you cash, like if you keep stopping things, you're basically just like, it's dead money. Let's not have any of those. The sort of thing that you could have, you could say, like, yep, let's do that in a meeting room. How do you know you're actually doing that? How do people not in the meeting room know that like you had that conversation? If the answer is there's a wiki page, it's like, good luck. I'd rather things in code. I'd rather things in tests. Again, you can. A lot of these are sort of like how to get this project going in a company is like sort of focus on all the finance ones. Convince your CFO that like we can write all those things you worry about. We can turn into code and tests, and they'll go like they'll love you for it. Talk to the compliance people; they'll love this stuff. Again, some examples. We should be backing everything up. Again, your infrastructure has an API. Get the information into something that you can query and make tests against it. I only want nodes in London and San Francisco. Again, you get the idea. Slightly weird. So like, remove all the London and San Francisco ones, it should be 0. But, another example that's sort of less about someone else is that sort of naming conventions. Like, again, before you set up anything, even like greenfield environment, or before you start a new project, someone's going to say, like, what should we call the servers? Someone asked Luke on stage, what does he call his servers? He gave a very bad answer. For those that are not there. Having a strong convention for naming is useful and important for people scanning things. But how often, like 6 months after the meeting where you absolutely decided it had to be this format, is it still true? Well, why not have a test for that? And again, this is I find this really readable. Some people hate the params. But it's the idea. Have tests for all these things you have in your meeting. So I've got a working example up on GitHub at the moment with a lot of of these assertions against the DigitalOcean API. I've got an example I haven't published, and I might sort of tie into the same project against the AWS API. So the more I was sort of playing around with it, the more I'm sort of thinking that a bunch of these statements actually are probably things that we all share, but the value is different. Maybe I can only spend 10 grand a month. You can spend $1 million, and you can spend 100 quid. But the fact that we all care about how our budget is probably one of the things we can agree on. So I think there's actually probably only so many of these different policies. And if we could list them all down, we can actually feed that back into the meetings we have and make the meetings structured around the tests. So test-driven meetings, I don't know. Definitely off the cuff. And we've got code that we can run all the time. We've now got a set of tests that assert all the policies. And remember, back to why I like test-driven development it's because you're designing. Test-driven development, some people sort of say is the wrong name. It's test-driven design. And what we've done is we've turned all these design statements into code that we can run, and they're going to fail because those things aren't true yet. But now we have the tests, we can provision some infrastructure. And you might provision that with anything, and pick your poison, really. There's a bunch of interesting work going on around sort of actually provisioning some of the cloud infrastructure with Puppet. I think there was a talk yesterday around sort of using the Google Cloud Compute module. So declaring in the Puppet DSL instances for you to launch, so GC instance, GC disk, there's a bunch of network stuff there. And that's actually a Puppet Labs module. That's quite interesting. While I was writing the DigitalOcean sort of test suite, I wrote, broadly speaking, the same thing for firing up droplets in DigitalOcean. But there's also, those are sort of instance examples. There's a Tom, whose nickname is Bob T. Fish for some reason, has a load of resources for setting up the Amazon VPC network as well. We're getting our infrastructure and code, not just our hosts, but everything, allows us to start thinking about writing tests for everything, not just our nodes, not just our hosts. So I said that's 2 examples down. This bit splits into a few bits. So who in the room is already using PuppetDB, either open source or enterprise? So, yeah, probably half. If you're not, seriously, PuppetDB is awesome. It's the amount of data in there is brilliant. So quick pitch for PuppetDB. There's a bunch of talks on this anyway. It's a Puppet Labs project. It's part of the enterprise suite as well. The reason I love it is that it stores an awful lot of data. I think most people sort of end up just sort of using nearly the sort of for collected resources and a bunch of the sort of built-in Puppet stuff. Not too many people go sort of spelunking into PuppetDB and using the data for other things, except dashboards. I think there's loads of potential. and it contains the recent fact information from the nodes. It has the catalogs from the nodes. It has a whole bunch of operational metrics about the sort of health of your Puppet infrastructure in there. And better than the data in there is the API for getting things out. And you can probably see where this is going is that, well, there's a database, it has lots of information, it has an API, and I'm obsessed with tests. Let's write some tests against PuppetDB. Writing the tests against the sort of like cloud infrastructure can only get us so far. And that API for your infrastructure doesn't know anything about what's on the nodes. It knows about the existence, it knows about their size, it knows about whether like features like backup or the monitoring is enabled. It doesn't know like whether it like the thing called web server is actually running a web server. But PuppetDB does. And again, we can sort of all these things that like we'd go into a meeting room and we'd decide on. Like, right, okay, stop it. Like everyone's firing up instances, and everyone chooses their own arbitrary operating system. This is a recipe for disaster. You go into a room and decide, right, there is one true operating system, and it's I'm not going there. But like, you will have decided in your organization that you run one or two or whatever. You like, but it's probably not like that spiraling out of control is not something anyone wants. So let's write a test to make sure that's true. Well, PuppetDB has the facts. We can query the facts for all the nodes that PuppetDB knows about, and we can check whether it's Ubuntu, or we can check whether it's Red Hat. And if it's not, we can fail the test. And again, we're writing our tests ahead of our implementation if we get good at it. Maybe you have a whole bunch of sort of like packages or like configuration around sort of security. And Travis mentioned I used to work at the UK government, so I did a whole bunch of work with sort of audit, compliance, risk management, and the idea that like sort of turning the sort of those statements in an audit into like assertions that you're running all the time, like your auditor will like love you. It's again like, well, the rules for the audits are shared. The implementations might be a bit different, but a whole bunch of that is the same for us all. If we had if someone sat there and went through like the sort of FITS audit or whatever and wrote tests against PuppetDB for this, like that would be awesome. Someone should do that. Again, we can do this in code, and like this isn't. There's nothing else. This isn't a sort of and there's a massive library behind that. This is all of the code for this, pretty much. I think that the only magic bit there is the nodes function that gets the list of nodes. Again, you can come up with lots of examples. I want to limit how many Puppet resources I'm using. So I mentioned that there's an awful lot of operational metrics in PuppetDB that are pretty much just in the API and not really surfaced anywhere else. And I went spelunking in there and found a whole bunch of interesting stuff. So having loads of resources, looking at catalog compilation time, you want to keep it below a certain point. You might say, well, once it reaches a certain point, we want to look at scaling this or tweaking that or performance tuning or cutting some stuff out. Well, keep an eye on that. Make those conversations into code. One of the really interesting ones, actually, and the documentation on the PuppetDB website talks about like if you're running a really high catalog duplication rate, PuppetDB will slow down. You don't want that to happen. And it gives you an idea of sort of like, well, if it's about, I think, sort of 90%, you're good. So that's in the documentation, but like, let's keep an eye on it. Let's have a test for that. And again, like really explicit ones, sort of, well, expect the catalog duplication rate to be above 90%. So again, similar to the other ones, this is all online. So there's a bunch of example code. It's examples. I'd be interested in sort of fleshing that out if people are interested in it. So PuppetDB is this amazing source of context for tests. So that was sort of this sort of, well, convert your meetings into code and run them against PuppetDB. But I showed sort of Serverspec earlier, and I mentioned that sort of, well, you're describing your services, you're describing your packages, you're describing properties of files, and you start thinking, well, or users or groups or whatever it is, and you start going, oh, this is quite similar to Puppet. So I thought, well, could you generate the Serverspec tests from PuppetDB data? And the obvious answer is yes. On the scale of like, do this now to think a bit about this, this is definitely on the think a bit about this, because I'm not absolutely sure this is useful. But it does give you like, if you have an existing Puppet infrastructure, it does give you a way of getting a test suite that you can use in a whole bunch of different contexts very, very quickly. Monitoring was sort of discussed this morning at the keynote as well. And one of the sort of things I was sort of looking at, I mean, sort of monitoring, you often have sort of something to collect data, so collect D, diamond, whatever. You often have something that sort of like aggregates and stores it, sort of maybe that's Graphite. You might have something like Nagios or Sensu that's making assertions against Graphite. So you've got this sort of nice componentized sort of decoupled system. If you step back and think about Puppet, basically you've got the Puppet agent. That's our collect D. That's the thing that's collecting information. You've got PuppetDB, which is storing a whole bunch of information in the same way as Graphite. But we can write tests against that information. So what I was playing around with was basically PuppetDB knows where all the hosts, so we can automatically generate sort of like command line tools based on the sort of context. So I haven't actually done this yet with the node classifier, but you could, and here it's sort of, well, run all the tests or run the tests on the master. First and second are basically just dummy host names. Much more interesting in a real world scenario would be doing it sort of like run the tests on the web servers, run the tests on the like arbitrary classification from the node classifier. That's sort of like, again, we have the data. And we can match Puppet resources to Serverspec resources. So I've done a little bit of this. Again, sort of, well, Puppet has package. The sort of types here, the assertions of a package should be installed or should not be installed depending on the param. A service should be enabled, should be running depending on the param. User groups should exist. We just map it like that's sort of naive. And doesn't cover all the resources in both. But that would it proves that it's possible. I say whether it's worth doing all of the work, I haven't quite decided yet. So, for instance, on a Puppet Enterprise sort of master server, so this is remember that I haven't written any code specific to my infrastructure at this point. All I'm doing is saying there's PuppetDB. I have a small like helper. It's probably about 30 lines of Ruby. And it will generate Serverspec tests and a runner for everything in your entire infrastructure. So you get like a lot of power very, very quickly. And you might be getting tens of tests per node for every node that you can run, again, like without any code, which is pretty interesting. So, like, while I was doing this, it was sort of, I thought I had a bug in my code, because I kept so I literally just brought up Puppet Enterprise stack, like a few nodes come up, I ran the rate command to run the test suite, and it ran a load of tests, and I was like, woohoo, and one of them failed, and I was like, oh no, I've got a problem in my code. It turns out, actually, I had a problem in how I'd set up Puppet Enterprise, and it was telling me I'd broken it. And it was like, maybe this is useful. I said like all the others, this is online. Have a play around with it. If it is useful, extending it so it covers all the resources and does all the right things wouldn't actually be an awful lot of work. So I'd be interested in some feedback or pull requests. Like the fact that you're sort of reasserting things is sort of maybe not that useful. I think where this is useful is actually because Serverspec is just running as rspec, and there's an awful lot of ways of basically output formatters for rspec, including things like JUnit, including things like Graphite, as a bridge to get an awful lot of the data that you've built up in your infrastructure around Puppet. And for example, you could have this run for every machine by your monitoring system. And at that point, you're running it more regularly. At that point, you're getting sort of information over time in a different place for a different use case than configuration management, and you get it all for free. It's quite compelling, I think. So I said this is basically a sort of series of just like experiments, not necessarily related, but tied together by testing. I said monitoring a few times, but I think so certainly for aspects of this, the question, is this monitoring, is a good one? The answer is probably. But actually, is it testing or is it monitoring is to an extent a question of, in my mind, of when you run these things. You should write loads of monitoring checks, but you've got this existential crisis of you can't run the checks until something exists. But you can write them, and I think it's this, I think sort of testing and monitoring are more about what you're trying to do and when you run something than anything else. So like, is it monitoring? Possibly. The high level thing here as well is sort of, we talk a lot about infrastructure as code. But actually, we're definitely still moving towards that goal. And we've got really good tools for doing like host level infrastructure as code. But actually, my infrastructure isn't a single host. Like, if it is, it's not very interesting, probably, unless it's a 40-year-old mainframe that I went to a birthday party of. Your infrastructure is probably changing over time. It's probably large. It's probably complex. And who can say you genuinely have that as code? I think the closest we've got to a bunch of this is really sort of infrastructure from code. Like, we declare some code, and we end up with some infrastructure. But that's, we don't have that, the Puppet agent loop. We don't have the sort of, the distance between the code and the resulting infrastructure is still, in my view, sort of too large in loads of cases. We genuinely want to just treat our infrastructure like code, and I don't think we're there yet, but we're sort of, I think testing feels like if I have some code, I can absolutely write tests. I can do static analysis. I can do dynamic analysis. There's a lot of things that I would take for granted if I'm writing code. We don't yet have all of the pieces, the sort of analogous things for infrastructure. So I think we're still heading there. I said sort of static dynamic analysis there. I'm now off in the back going what does that look like for infrastructure? That is someone should seriously think about that. I think sort of, if it's code, we should be able to do all these things. Lint for infrastructure, what does that look like? So this was about testing, but you could sort of get the thread. And in doing this and talking to people about the sort of, the approach, I settled on this word policy and sort of ran with it with the talk. A whole bunch of those assertions are things that it's not the room of developers, engineers, and operations people. Yes, you care about them, but it's coming from outside. And we talk a lot about sort of DevOps being an opportunity to have those conversations with finance, with sales, with the person who's the CFO, with the security people. they're not, we can think in code, and if we can bridge that conversation in something that's assertable over time, we will get much more reliable, ultimately. Going into a meeting and saying, yes, we'll do something, and then them coming back telling you you didn't do that 6 months later, we lose credibility. So having ways that every day there is a computer checking that we're still doing those things. And if we're not, we can go back and have the conversation. Really will, I think, sort of like this idea of sort of talking about policy with people for whom that's what they're setting is sort of like, I think, an interesting way of communicating intent. And test-driven development is all about that sort of, what am I trying to do? So hopefully that's made some sense. I said, if anyone's got specific questions about any of this or the general area, or I'm happy to take them. Thank you. Oh, there's one down here.
So Gareth, you mentioned like there's a fine line between testing and also having that like constant monitoring. It's a matter of like where you use it or when you use it or when you make the station. But when you've got like bundle tasks and you have things that you can throw into a monitoring solution, like when you've been putting this together, like where do you plan on executing this and what intervals and what systems can make that happen on a more regular basis?
So the heart of the question there was around sort of where would you execute this? How often would you execute it? Sort of. So part of it's like for me the sort of that coming back to sort of Puppet, that sort of interval of how often you run Puppet. Maybe you've chosen half an hour, maybe you've chosen an hour, maybe you've chosen longer. For me, the entire discussion of that being an interval is a bug. We're limited, broadly speaking, by like, would you run these sort of heavier agents every minute? Like, no. Is your network up to sending all of that information all the time? No. But look at monitoring. Actually, for monitoring, how often are you running your monitoring checks? A lot. I hope we can get down to a point where basically like where intervals don't matter. Certainly for the hacky prototype stuff, it does because it's written in something that's broadly speaking slow. Like the checks are slow, they're expensive. Honestly, I don't know the answer. So this is definitely sort of experiments. I would like for things like this and for things like Puppet just to literally be running all the time. And we don't talk about intervals. It's just like constant. In the same way as, and if you talk to monitoring people, like they get really frustrated when people are sort of saying like, oh, people build monitoring tools and the lowest amount of time it can deal with is 1 second. Like that's not enough for certain applications. So monitoring is at that point now where people are like, a second, like it should be milliseconds, it should be microseconds, it should be tiny fractions of the smallest things. And I think at the moment both with something like this because of the data and how it's done, and with configuration management, we're up at the half an hour, and like all of that should collapse, but it's not going to do now. So I don't really know the answer, and I talked about something different, but hopefully that made sense. Any other questions? So. So the question there was like, what was the CI system that I was using? It was Worker, but again, like you could do it with Travis, you could do it with Jenkins. I wouldn't go off and use a new CI tool. You're probably already using one. Hopefully, you're already using one. I've probably got time for one more question. Yeah, yes. Oh, over there.
Have you done anything with expressing SLA as policy?
So the question there was, have I done anything around specifying basically service level agreements with policy? No, but it's exactly that sort of like thing that would be really interesting. Like turning SLA agreements into code that we're running as test suites and doing that before we build the thing to meet those SLAs. It's exactly that sort of thing where I think there's value. I wished I'd done it a few times. Like in hindsight, now I've hacked some things together. But Nope, and I've got 10 seconds left, and it's flashing at me. So thank you very much. Hopefully that was interesting.